Alright, Blade Vortex Occultist build guide. Let's go. So, right from the initial build planning, this build was made to be an Uber Elder killer and was very much specialized for boss killing. Right now you can see what was my fourth Uber kill playing. And I think that this one serves as a perfect example to how the build has held up against its goal of taking the boss down in Hardcore Incursion League. I definitely make a lot of bad moves and mistakes in this fight, and yet through the almighty power of Occultist, I managed to stay alive and put out a decently fast Uber Elder kill. So, while the rest of this fight plays out, I'll go over the core mechanics that make this character so durable for these extended boss fights. So first things first, it's a Blade Vortex build. The newly updated BV from the Incursion patch is super strong DPS wise, and it also allows you to deal damage while dodging around, which is really important for this build specifically. I've mostly gone with basic crit spell scaling on the Blade Vortex itself, no damage conversion, but I do have some mods to gain physical damage as elemental damage on my weapon, and I've got a bit of chaos damage in a few places here and there. And additionally, Vol Blade Vortex serves as a pretty perfect on-demand boost of extra bursty DPS whenever you end up needing that. Now, the defenses are where the true power of the build really shines, and Occultist is definitely still a top-tier ascendancy choice for making very, very tanky characters. The combination of super low ES recharge delay and the Occultist's Wicked Ward Ascendancy node make for an insane amount of ES sustain, even without any leech or regeneration whatsoever, so long as you can avoid taking some damage for about a second. That's all it needs. I've also stacked a good bit of both physical and elemental mitigation, as well as a couple debuffs on the enemies to kind of protect from the one-shot type situations where I can maybe die too fast to get away and start the ES recharge. I'll cover all the individual bits of all that when I go over the gear and the passive tree choices for the build. Now, for anybody that's concerned about the general mapping side of things, I've actually found that the build maps at a decent speed, at least as far as a dedicated boss killing build goes. Profane Bloom pretty much serves as a mini Impulsives, and Vile Bastion gives super strong ES regen while you're killing trash mobs. Now, you're not going to go as zooming around as fast as your run-of-the-mill Elementalist BV build, but as long as you keep to like mostly indoor narrow map layouts, you should find that you can grind out your levels quite quickly. And with that, I think I've got the basics covered, so I'm going to let the rest of this fight play out, and then we will dive more into the details of what makes this character so powerful. Alright, let's get things started with the gear for the build. First up, the unique items, and the key piece of all of them being the shield, which is pretty much the reason that I pursued going for an Occultist build again this league. The new Apex Supremacy unique shield. It is an upgraded Incursion unique. You need the Apex Slumber shield plus the appropriate vial to upgrade it, and it is just insanely powerful because it is almost like a Soul Strike in the amount of faster ES recharge that it gives, but it has more energy shield than a Soul Strike. It has a little bit of damage. It makes you essentially immune to bleeding as a CI build, and it gives you some maximum resistances if you configure your build to poison yourself. So all in all, definitely the most important item of the build. However, it is pretty expensive, so if you can't afford it, you can make do with just like a rare energy shield. but it's probably going to want to be your first priority as far as a big purchase for the build goes. The rest of the uniques being used, body armor is an incandescent heart, generally pretty easy to acquire. You're looking for a high ES roll and ideally a high elemental as chaos roll if you can get both of them. It gives you a large boost in elemental mitigation with 25% of elemental damage from hits being taken as chaos, which essentially negates it because, again, you don't take chaos damage as CI. And overall, just gives you just enough ES to kind of get by with Occultist carrying the rest of your ES values compared to just wearing a Rare Vol Regalia or something. In the belt, I've got Bated Breath. This thing's too good to pass up for Occultist. High ES, a little bit of int, and massive ES recharge rate modifier, which affects how fast your ES refills when that recharge does kick in. And additionally, this league is worked even better with new belt corruption implicits and the double corruption altar. You can see mine is actually double corrupted. I've got percent ES and percent life. The percent life isn't doing anything, but there's at least 5 or 6 positive belt outcomes for implicits. Things like discipline effect, skill effect duration. So Bated Breath, great item, and also very easy to chase after a corrupted version with a nice implicit. And same thing for the ring, Dream Fragments. You can see this one has another corruption implicit, discipline effect. Now, neither of these are necessary to have corruptions. Just be aware that it is a nice upgrade to pursue that shouldn't cost you too much. And then the reason for Dream Fragments, aside from that, mana and mana regeneration are both good, since we're kind of only relying on regeneration to maintain the cost of the Blade Vortex. And then the immunity to chill and freeze let you wear another unique flask, where otherwise you would probably have to wear a magic flask with freeze removal. And we don't want to have to be doing that, so keep that on all the time. And the last unique item is Sintrek. These aren't mandatory at all. They're just really good. It's hard to find a pair of rare boots that are better with the same amount of energy shield and high move speed. But then also the dexterity roll helps because we do need a bit of stats with this build. Dexterity and strength are both kind of hard to make work without some good rolls on your gear. You need 155 dexterity for a level 20 Blade Vortex, or 159 dexterity if you get a level 21. And then also the body armor itself requires 99 strength, so keep that in mind when you start looking towards the rare items, which are the gloves, the helmet, one of the rings, and the amulet. So aside from just looking for, ES, gear, high energy shield values, it's really important to prioritize resists and some stats on these items. Since we are wearing quite a few uniques, it gets harder to cap out the resists and get your strength and dexterity. I've completely given up on trying to get LE weakness capped. I'm sitting at about 90% all res right now, so I've just been avoiding elemental weakness maps. Obviously, I could run them. I could use a curse removal flask to just kind of negate it, but I don't feel very safe relying on a flask for that, so I just kind of avoid them altogether. But aside from those stats, amulet, you're going to want to try to get flat ES and percent ES. Mine also has the strength roll, and then my ring has my dex roll. If you could get mana regeneration on either of those, that would be nice, but not really mandatory. The gloves are just ES plus resists. Maybe you get a dex roll. And the helmet is where things get a little interesting again. Mine actually has a temple modifier from the new Incursion Temple, which gives it a bunch of lightning res and then also physical damage from hits taken as lightning damage. Now this is another not necessary for the build, but if you do want to start pushing the end game of end game bosses, that extra basically physical mitigation, since you have better elemental resistance than physical, it turns into some pseudo phys mitigation. It is very, very helpful, and I would definitely recommend trying to get something like this if you can get your hands on it. And that covers all the gear, I believe, except for the weapon, which you can see right here. It is a Shaper crafted foil. I made this one myself. I actually have another video that kind of goes over how to craft these Shaper foils. They're not really budget weapons by any means. However, they are extremely, extremely powerful compared to the cost of making one, I would say. And you can just see right now all the crazy stats it has on it. And if you get lucky, you can make these for as low as a few exalted orbs and then not much else. But if you can't get one of these, if you're starting off cheap, you really just look for a generic caster melee weapon. So either a dagger or a scepter with like attack speed, roll, maybe some spell damage, some spell crit, some crit multi, just any combination of those, and you'll pretty much be good to go to get started. And with that, I think we shall move on to the gems. So right now I have my boss killing set up in. I swap a few gems around depending on what I'm doing, but this is the boss stuff. The Blade Vortex links, you can see Blade Vortex, well, Vol Blade Vortex, Controlled Destruction, Critical Strikes, Critical Damage, Efficacy, and Concentrated Effect. And some of these aren't the strongest multipliers, but the build kind of ends up awkward on the links, but you still end up doing quite a lot of damage even with what some people might see as suboptimal gems. In the helmet, I've got Blasphemy and Feeble, plus Arctic Armor and an Enlightened support. The Arctic Armor I will swap out for Purity of Ice depending on which fight I'm doing. So, you know, something like Shaper or Uber Elder, I'll keep the Purity in since they have a lot of cold damage. If it's a fight that doesn't have a lot of cold damage, I'll pop the Arctic Armor in there. In the shield, I've got my other auras, which is Discipline and Clarity, also supported by Enlighten. Getting these Enlightens, level 3, is really nice once you get to the bossing with the build, because the higher level your Enlightens are, obviously the less mana you're reserving, which kind of just turns into you can level up Clarity more for more mana regeneration to help sustain the costs of the Blade Vortex. The gloves, I've got my utility curse type set up, Orb of Storms, Power Charge on crit, Arcane Surge, and then a self-casted Assassin's Mark. I wish I could get a curse on hit, there's just not enough links in here. We really need the Power Charge on crit and the Arcane Surge. And then the boots, Castle Damage Taken, Increased Duration, Immortal Call, and a second Discipline gem, but we're just using this for the Vol Discipline. It's here so that it's linked to the Duration gem to make it last longer. And then the weapon, just normal shield charge stuff. Shield charge 4 to 5 faster attacks. Now the swap that I do, or that I kind of switched to for bossing from mapping, with the normal mapping setup, what I was actually running was I had no extra purity or Arctic Armor, and instead I was running double Blasphemies in the helmet. I had my Assassin's Mark in the helmet, so that was just 2 Blasphemies plus the Discipline plus the Clarity, and that helps you to get more DPS on trash mobs. You get power charges while you're running through the maps, and Assassin's Mark gives you some mana on kills, so those mana regeneration issues don't show up as much while you're mapping. But that is not necessarily worth for the bosses. So if you're mapping, no concern for bosses yet. Keep that in mind. Double Blasphemy can be really good. Once you get to the bosses, you want to swap that around. And then the other gem swap is an Increased Duration gem. Currently, I'm kind of at an advantage because my body armor went white sockets on the Corruption Altar, and I can swap a blue for a red. But Duration for concentrated effect for mapping. Duration is the best support here. If you are not on a body armor like this one and you want to keep the blue sockets, what you can swap is Increased Area of Effect for the concentrated effect. Or alternatively, you can drop Efficacy entirely and run an Empower gem in that extra socket that you would swap for the Duration gem. And then in the last blue socket, you would swap between Concentrated Effect and either Efficacy or the Increased AoE gem. But my current setup is like this for the mapping. And I think that covers it. The rest stay mostly the same. On to the flasks. So like I mentioned before, double unique flasks thanks to the freeze immunity from the ring. Sin's Rebirth is just mega powerful for the build. It's basically like an Atziri flask in terms of damage. It's a little bit less than the Atziri flask for my current setup as far as DPS goes, but whereas the Atziri flask gives Leech and Chaos Res, which this build can't use either of those things, the Sin's Rebirth creates a smoke cloud which blinds enemies and also removes Ignite and gives you Ignite immunity during the flask effect, which are both very nice. The other unique flask, Taste of Hate. This thing is another big tank flask with a little bit of DPS, but it's mostly there for the defensive value. If you can't afford one, you don't really need it right away. You could swap in Atziri's Promise in that spot for maybe some damage, or alternatively, just run a blue flask there. Either a Jade, a Sulfur, or a Silver flask. Kind of just goes up to preference, whatever you want to run. And then the other three flasks, I have a Basalt flask and a Diamond flask. These both need... One of them needs a grounding modifier, the other one needs a warding. Doesn't really matter which one's where, but you want that curse and shock immunity. And then a Quicksilver flask of adrenaline for the zoomy zoom speeds. Next up, we've got the passive tree. So first, let's start with the ascendancy stuff. You can see I've kind of just got the two big wings. Wicked Ward, I mentioned, pretty much the core of the build. The ES recharge not being interrupted if recharge has begun recently. Gives you essentially 4 seconds of mega recharge whenever it starts. And that allows you to tank all the big hits on the fights. Vile Bastion gives you your stun immunity. Gives a little bit of extra ES and some regen while you clear trash. Profane Bloom helps with clear. Has the explosions. And Malediction is a super powerful debuff in addition to giving an extra curse and a little bit of extra damage if you've killed recently. So the Malediction debuff makes enemies deal 10% reduced damage and take 10% increased, which on top of the Enfeeble that we're running in the Blasphemy ends up having 2 separate debuffs to lower the damage output on whatever enemies we're fighting. For the rest of the tree, basically just normal CI pathing for the most part. You can see I have the Chaos Inoculation, obviously. Things worth mentioning, it's a crit build, so you're getting crit clusters whenever you can, whenever you path by them. I have 1 Aura Cluster for reduced mana reservation, mostly. It also gives a little bit of radius, which does affect the Blasphemy, and it gives a little bit of aura effect for the discipline and the clarity, but mostly that's just there for the reservation side of things. I have 1 duration cluster for Blade Vortex and both the Vol skills that we're running, and I also have 1 small mana cluster with Deep Thoughts to just help again with the mana sustain. And Deep Thoughts is just really good in general. It also gives a little bit of int, which turns into some energy shield. For the jewels on the tree, we've got a couple of important ones here. The first one ties back into the Apep Supremacy Shield, which had the 3% max res while poisoned. So we need to poison ourselves. We don't really want to rely on just enemies hitting us. We don't want to rely on the 25% chance to be poisoned. That's not going to go off consistently enough. So what I've done is I've comboed the unique Golden Rule Jewel, which has poison you inflict is reflected to you. I've comboed that with just a regular rare jewel that has % chance to poison on hit. So now I have a 5% chance to poison enemies. If I poison them, it goes back to me. I get the max resistances from the shield. And we're good to go. Now the other rare jewels that I'm running are mostly just ES, damage, and maybe some faster start of ES recharge. Let's see them really quickly here. And then 1 more big jewel is the Watcher's Eye Prismatic Jewel, the Elder Jewel. Mine, I got really lucky recently and was able to upgrade to a double statted one that also has max mana gained as max ES. Now, I didn't have this jewel for the first 3 Uber Elder kills I did, so it's 100% not necessary. It's just really, really good. The stat that you do need, though, is the faster start of Energy Shield recharge, since it goes up to 40%, which is another really big chunk of lowering that delay. So now I think I've covered all the faster recharge stuff. It's on some jewels. It's on the Watcher's Eye. Got a little bit here as well from Essence Surge. And then the shield puts my character currently at 131% increased energy shield recharge occurrence modifier. Now this adds up to basically giving me a 0.87 second delay on my ES recharge. So that means that 0.87 seconds, that's all it takes for me to not take damage and my ES recharge starts. So it's less than a second that I have to dodge away to get the recharge kicking in. And it all adds up. Very, very powerful overall. I think that's it on the tree. Nothing else really of note other than just some generic things. I'll have a link to the character profile and the tree in the description of the video if you want to check that out. For the bandits, I would recommend initially helping Alira. I was helping Alira until level 96, which I'm currently at which point I dropped Alira for the 2 passive points since it allowed me to get an extra jewel socket. Now, to be able to do this, obviously you have to have enough resistances to be able to lose the Alira resistances. And it really helps if you're like mid-90s and you can get both of these jewel sockets that have mana nodes leading up to them, since that mana kind of helps counter the lost flat mana regeneration from Alira as well. And then for the Pantheon, I've got, this is the mapping setup that I run on this character and almost every other character. Soul of Lunaris, Soul of Growthcoal, helps you go fast, makes mobs hit weaker. For most bosses, I'll swap Lunaris for Solaris, gives extra mitigation when there's only one enemy nearby, and helps deal with some elemental hits and things like crits. And then for the Uber Elder fight specifically, I will also swap my minor Pantheon to Soul of Yugel with the upgrade for reduced cold damage taken if you've been hit recently. But other than Uber Elder, I'm sticking with Growthcoal all the way on the Pantheons. And that's the build. That is the whole endgame. That is the setup. That is everything you need to know. If all you care about is the endgame stuff, we're done. That's all you needed. But I'm also going to quickly go over the leveling side of things for people who want to know how I level the character or how I think it'll work well. I just leveled with Blade Vortex from level 12. It works pretty nicely, the new updated Blade Vortex. I used to not be a fan of Blade Vortex leveling. It's still not the fastest, but it does feel much nicer with the updated skill and a couple new uniques and rare items. So as far as the items go, I've got my leveling gear tab here. You can see the most important thing is this new String of Servitude belt. You want to get one with the skill effect duration roll. That obviously makes the Blade Vortex last longer, so less recasts early on. You can run through the zones a lot quicker, not having to stop. You're going to want a Tabula, and then pretty much just normal caster leveling items, Gold Rim, Wanderlust, Loctonials, whatever you like leveling with on casters. It all works. But the other stuff that I would mention is the new Sacrificial Heart Amulet, the unupgraded one, works quite well. It's a level 32 unique. Gives you a lot of damage and a little bit of move speed. I really liked using this one once I could wear it. And also you can buy a bunch and corrupt them if you want to try to get some extra power out of it, since the mana regeneration implicit doesn't really do a whole lot. And on top of that, there's also temple rare items, which I've got a few in here. The ones really worth mentioning to look for would be rings with the maximum life roll. You can see this has max life and percent life, and they're very low level rings. These can kind of just cover all your life needs while you're progressing, and you just use a couple ring slots instead of worrying about anything else. And then also the spell weapon modifier, which has 70 to 74% spell damage and gain non-chaos as extra chaos damage. These are like the ideal leveling weapon. Otherwise, you could just use something like an Axiom Scepter, but these work very, very well. And I think that's all there is on the gear. I've got a quick leveling tree that I'm about to pull up. You can see this. This is a Mind Over Matter Witch tree, since you're not going to be CI until much later. I will post a link to this tree in the description as well, but just really quickly. It's about a level 60-ish tree with some skill point quests thrown in. You can see on the Ascendancy I took Profane Bloom first, and then I just hopped to Vile Bastion. You can get Malediction early, but chances are once you get to level 70 or so and you want to swap to CI, you're not going to have Uber Lab done yet, and if you don't have Uber Lab, you really want Vile Bastion as soon as you go to the CI swap. So I would recommend getting Profane Bloom and then just finishing out the ES side of things. For the rest of the tree, it's mostly focused on defense, life, mana, with a little bit of damage here and there. Really, the Tabula and the leveling gear, if you can get some, is going to carry you as far as the damage is concerned. I've got a little bit of skill duration and a little bit of crit, but this is just for the sake of pathing. Yeah, mostly just a defensive passive tree. And then to wrap things up, I think the only thing left to talk about is your Blade Vortex links. Now, there's a lot of gems that you can use. Really, it probably doesn't matter too much. What I used and what I felt was good in order of preference, pretty much just priority as you can use them, because some are low level, some are high level. But you need your Blade Vortex, and then Controlled Destruction is the top tier support. Increased Duration, pretty great as well. I would say Onslaught and Concentrated Effect, have both of those and swap them. Onslaught for clearing mobs, Concentrated Effect for the bosses. Added fire damage and Arcane Surge or Efficacy, whichever one you feel like using. They're both pretty good. You get the duration from the Efficacy, you get the mana regeneration and the cast speed from the Arcane Surge. Both work quite well. And I think that's it. So that gets you up to level 70-ish, where you can swap to CI as soon as you... either as soon as you hit 70, really, but I would recommend doing it after killing Act 10 Katava and getting your Merciless Lab done, but that's still another thing that's up to you. And there you have it. That is the probably longest build guide that I've done to date, but I really wanted to go in depth on this character since I've had a lot of people very interested in it. I've had a ton of fun playing it, and it really feels like one of the most successful builds that I have played so far in hardcore. So if you have any extra questions, comments on things I might not have touched up on enough, make sure to ask in the comment section below. Like I said, I'll get a bunch of useful links in the description to things that I went over in the video. Thanks guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed the guide, and I will see you next time. Later.